Good morrow, everyone, and welcome to Shakespeare and Friends, the series in which we engage with some of the big questions surrounding Shakespeare and early modern history. I'm Darren Freebury-Jones, and my co-host is Rachel Aanstad. And I often find, Rachel, that when somebody learns what I do as a lecturer and as an author of several books on Shakespeare, one of the first things they'll say to me is, I've heard he didn't write them. And I have to refrain from my eyes rolling into the back of my
Take a
sockets and
deep
emitting
breath. Take a deep
a
breath.
deep breath, emitting a loud groan. But I think the question we're approaching in this episode, could Shakespeare have written
Mhm,
Shakespeare, is actually really useful in terms
mhm.
of offering some historical, contextual information. And I wondered if you could kick us off just by thinking a little bit about the early modern education system.
You bet. And I think the question, could Shakespeare have written his plays, is a fair one. I don't roll my eyes when people ask me that question. Um, but I will just say briefly about that whole kind of, let's call it a train of thought, uh, is that for years it dominated um, discussion spaces about Shakespeare. When I first got on the internet in the 90s, uh, I wanted to talk about Shakespeare and I wanted to talk about the plays, but every single forum was dominated by the authorship question. And I found that incredibly frustrating at the
Mm.
time because in a sense it's almost a moot question if you just want to talk about the plays. It doesn't matter. And but people like to think about that sort of thing. We like to think that we've gotten an insight into history. And I think that impulse is a good one and has led many scholars in the last 30 years, almost 40 years really, to really document not only his life to the best of our ability, which is difficult, but also the world that he lived in. And that's always kind of been my goal is to really understand the world that whoever wrote Shakespeare's plays lived in and kind of go at it from the outside in of saying, okay, this is the world that these plays were created in. What kind of person had the means and the opportunity to write those plays in that environment? And so, one of the first things that we have to look at is, in fact, education. Now, the picture behind me is the Shakespeare Schoolroom and Guildhall at Stratford-on-Avon. And this, to me, is the most exciting thing that this is still standing, that we can
Mm.
walk inside of this space and actually be where Shakespeare and his friends and his frenemies and who knows, all had to sit and learn Latin and arithmetic, geography, everything. And before we go too much farther, I want everybody to know that Darren's background is a reconstruction of the Rose Theater. It's a 3D computer model of Philip Henslow's Playhouse by Roger Clegg. And it's a project that Roger Clegg did, and you can Google that online and see the whole project, and it's really stunning. So back to the education. So
I thought when you said I just want to talk about Darren's background, I thought you were going to give a mini bio of me then, Rachel. I was like,
you
what you know
know,
that
I
I
think I think if you're tuning in, you probably know who Darren is. And if you don't, go back to the first episode when we talk about ourselves. We kind of try to avoid that till we get to the writer's corner. But yeah, I meant the picture behind you, which I think is really cool.
Yeah.
It's one of the nicer reconstructions that I've seen.
Mm.
All right, so education. during this era in the in the latter part of Elizabeth the First reign was very important socially, uh, to the state and also to anybody who wanted to function within that society. Uh, Literacy was considered a good thing, and even people in servants, uh, uh, craftspeople, to be able to read a list, to be able to calculate numbers, very important and a very useful job skill. And so, for that reason, literacy rates, especially in London, were incredibly high. And we need to talk about really two different kinds of literacy because there's the literacy of being able to read, and then there's the literacy of being able to read and write.
Mm,
And those are two different things. Many, many people can read, but can't write very well. Uh, as a writer, I have to work really hard still to write well. It's still something that I spend a lot of time, uh, trying to make a piece of writing good. I learned to read, and I you gradually get better at it over time if you're fortunate, if reading disabilities are a real thing. But once you kind of get that under your belt to the best of your ability, whatever that is, you're good to go. And so lots of people learned how to read that never learned how to write. And so that's really something to keep in mind when wondering, oh, well, how could a mere Glover's boy had, Glover's son have learned to read? Well, it was the in thing, it was the popular thing. It was like, uh, learning how to make a YouTube video or anything else. It was part of that environment. So, um, but schools started very young, really kind of a preschool. There were petty schools and dame schools, and they were usually for boys, but not always. Girls could attend, and they would learn basic reading and counting skills, probably just their ABCs, maybe a little bit of addition and subtraction. They'd learn manners. They would learn kind of basic sewing skills. All the kinds of little skills we need to function in the world that are best learned when we're very, very young. And this created this incredibly educated society for the time period, very unusual and a big departure from what had gone before, and a big part of why it became the early modern period, of why it was no longer medieval. So once you got out of the petty schools or the dame schools, then you would go on to a primary school, a grammar school, and typically only boys attended these. It was not illegal for girls to attend, but these could be a very hostile environment. There was a lot of bullying, there was a lot of beatings that happened if you got your assignment wrong, your lesson wrong. A lot of times you were beaten. And so it may be not so much that girls were excluded because people thought they weren't smart enough, but because they didn't want them to be hit as often as these boys were, unfortunately. And, you know, uh, this is not something to make light of. The abuse was terrible, just terrible. Uh, but all that aside, somehow most boys managed to learn in this environment, and they learned uh, Latin, basic geography, the foundations of rhetoric. Uh, in other words, how do you persuade someone? So this is sort of the very beginning of learning how to be a lawyer, which was considered a really important profession then. But also, uh, rhetoric was just an important skill in general to sort of show that you were somebody who knew how to think things through. And it's a really useful skill. I cannot recommend it highly enough. I wish it was still taught. in schools. Uh, Another skill that they taught was memorization. Using a memorization palace, how you can remember a series of words by identifying them with physical objects or, a place in your head. These two are techniques that I think, we would do well to learn, and some people do. Some people are champion memorizers and learn how to use these ancient memorization techniques, or not so ancient, I guess. All right. Uh, so about the age of 10, the students would start being taught by the head teacher or master. They would learn to translate from Latin to English, and depending on the instructor, might learn Greek, Italian, and or French. Uh, there's a lot of question about how could Shakespeare ever have learned Italian or French if he never left and never left English soil. And that's making a whole lot of assumptions right there. I'll get into this a little bit later. We don't know what he did. He could have left. We don't know. But what we do know is that French was the dominant language in the court and in legal situations for hundreds of years in England. And it didn't stop being a bilingual country just because English became the language of the land. So learning French was very easy to do. Um, Italian is not that different from French, really, once you start learning those Romance languages. And it was also a very useful language because it was often the language of finance. So Italian and French, very common for people to learn. Uh, there was lots of people coming in and out of London all the time, lots of languages being spoken. And so, you know, we tend to think for some reason of English people in this time period as only speaking English. Um, I suspect that when we look back in time, we like to think, oh, those people knew less than we do. And they were less advanced in their education. And I'm not at all sure that that's the case. They didn't just live in another time, they lived in another place, and they lived in a very multicultural society. So, kids could learn some Italian and or French. We know that they learned some Greek. We don't know how much. It wouldn't have been ancient Greek. It would have been the scholastic Greek that was common at the time. I'm not going to go down that path, it's too complicated. But it again, it was part of an education because a lot of words had Greek roots or Latin roots, and by understanding Greek and Latin, you could understand all languages better. And then, of course, clergy needed to know Latin too. So that was the language of the clergy. And let's see, what else have we got here in my notes? Okay. Uh, Writing and performing plays were useful educational practices, very common. And this is also something that I wish was done more commonly in grammar and secondary education because there's nothing like writing a play and inhabiting a character to really get you invested in that story. And it produced a lot of playwrights. You know, um, for us today, for somebody to become a playwright seems like such a wild direction to take. But back in those days, everybody learned how to write plays. And so it's sort of like saying, yeah, I can still do what I did in grammar school, big whoop. Uh, so again, that's something we need to wrap our head around because a lot of what comes up is, well, if he was learning how to make gloves, why did he ever learn to write plays? And it's because it was part of the homework they all did. All right. Uh, so at the age of 14, at that point, boys, at this point it was only boys, could go to university if they could afford it or if they could find a sponsor. And we know that Shakespeare's family's finances went a little awry at this point because his father got caught in some inside trading with sheep skins or something, sheep hides. And that may be why Shakespeare didn't go to university. It may be that he knew he didn't want to go into the church or law or medicine. And so he was like, what do I need university for? I don't want to go do any of those things. So we don't know why he didn't go to university, but he did not. And Darren, he was not the only one who didn't go to university,
No,
right?
no, certainly not. Lots of great playwrights of the period. Thomas Kidd, who
Mm-hmm.
often translated French and Italian, didn't go
Mm-hmm.
to university so far as we know. He went to Merchant Taylor School in London. The likes of Thomas Dekker, we have no record of him going to university. Anthony Mundy, Henry Shettle, the list goes on really. But when it comes to grammar school education, some scholars say early modern grammar school education almost the equivalent of a classics degree today.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that grammar school education really would have prepared Shakespeare very well for a career as an actor playwright. So you have this grammar school education instituted by the Dutch humanist Erasmus, and Erasmus recommended that students read every type of author in order to fill up your store. And of course, that's what we see with Shakespeare's plays. Is he's not about telling new and original plots. He's about telling existing stories in inventive ways. And schoolboys would have spent long times hunched over classical writers such as Terence, Horace, Ovid, Virgil, Seneca. And we see that in Shakespeare's plays, particularly his early plays and his narrative poems, such as Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, which are two of his most explicitly Ovidian poems. And as you mentioned, there were performances of plays, we believe, that students could have performed in plays by the likes of Terence and Plautus at grammar school education. And I think that emphasis on memorization,
Mm-hmm.
improvisation as part of the grammar school curriculum, really great if you want to go eventually into being an actor or into being
Mm-hmm.
a playwright. And rhetoric as well. I couldn't agree more. I think it would be great if rhetoric was more widely studied, that art of persuasive communication and those figures of repetition that I think would help an actor to learn lines, including long declamatory speeches. And what you do find is that Shakespeare, in my view, is more proficient with rhetorical devices than some university educated playwrights, such as George Peele, for instance. So I think it's very easy to underestimate today, looking at things through our 21st century lens, the value of grammar school education. And I think it was an ideal education to prepare Shakespeare for the career he had eventually embarked on.
Well, and that I think that people we get stuck in our own time period, and I understand why. But the idea of little boys learning Latin is kind of hard to wrap our head around. You know,
Mm,
and all these kind of very esoteric subjects for us that we think of, oh, that's very highbrow, that's very Ivy League, was popular culture for them.
mm,
And uh, once we can make that leap of understanding that their popular culture was what we think of as remote Ivy League university stuff, then we can get out of the idea that his lack of a university education made any difference
mm,
at all.
mm.
Um,
And you
it's
so
all.
often find with university educated playwrights that they don't have more formidable learning applicable to
No.
plays. So Robert Greene, for example, university educated playwright, went to Cambridge and Oxford. My goodness, he jumbles his mythology occasionally. And with regards to Shakespeare, we're talking about his grammar school education, which is an assumption, I suppose, that there's a tradition that John Shakespeare bred his son for some time in a free school. And that almost certainly would have been what was known as King's New School in Stratford-upon-Avon. It was established in 1553. It was just down the road from Shakespeare's birthplace. But we don't have records
No.
for Shakespeare attending grammar school. But then we don't have records for any other students during
Mhm.
that period at King's New School. So I think it would be quite an assumption to say that nobody went to grammar school in
Mhm.
Stratford-upon-Avon just because we don't have those records. We also don't have records for Robert Greene attending grammar school, but of course he was educated, and we know he went on to university.
Definitely. Uh,
Just one more thing
yeah.
with what you were saying about Latin. It reminds me, I was giving a talk to a society a couple of years ago, and I was speaking about my eldest Oliver. He goes to a Welsh speaking school, and they're encouraged to speak Welsh in the classroom and in the playground. And I was having a meal just before giving my talk. I think my talk was on Shakespeare and kingship. And I always find it quite curious eating just before giving a public speech. But this lady said to me, "Oh, do you not find that holds him back in terms of his English, being encouraged to speak Welsh in the playground and in the classroom?" And my rebuttal was that the same was applicable to Shakespeare in terms of being encouraged to speak Latin. And he turned out to be pretty good at reading and writing English, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. He seemed to figure that out just fine, didn't he? I think something else that we need to consider is that universities are not the last word on education and never have been. People became educated before universities existed, and people become educated today without a university. And lots of people learn languages without, ever going past high school or even grammar school. Many people are multilingual without an education. And what you need to do is practice and be immersed. There's some question if they can really even teach languages in a classroom setting. As anyone who ever took high school Spanish knows, and then tried to go to Mexico and talk, you're lost. You're lost. It doesn't do it for you. You need to spend time actually speaking the language, preferably with other people who speak the language. And certainly Shakespeare was in an environment where that would have been easy to find. Like, just imagine what London must have sounded like. Uh, you
Mm.
know, Dutch, Italian, French, uh, you know, every possible language.
Accents now unknown.
Yes, now unknown. From people from Egypt, people from, all over the Mediterranean would come into London, and they had to somehow communicate. Then there were other languages. There were languages that only sailors spoke. There were languages that only thieves spoke. Thieves' cant was a real thing. And so, uh, in a sense, we kind of have a luxury, certainly in the United States, of many of us being monolingual, in that we only have to learn one language to get by as English speakers. Typically, it is on the not necessarily oppressed class, but the class that needs to adapt that learns more than one language. And so it made a lot of sense for somebody in the artisan class to be able to negotiate with merchants from many countries. If somebody comes from Italy and wants to special order some gloves, you need to be able to talk to them or you've lost that sale. So, I just want to really convey what a practical skill it was to be multilingual in
Mm.
16th and early 17th century London. Uh, would have been very common compared to the way it is, where I live in the United States, where, you know, most of us who, uh, grew up in a white household, especially Anglo, we only had to learn English basically. So uh,
Mm.
I think that that's kind of a wealth that we unfortunately don't have. But moving on. So unless, do you have anything else to add to all
Just
of
in my
that?
sense with early modern university education
Yeah.
was that it was primarily vocational, that it would prepare
Mm,
you for roles in the church or in law or state administration. And I don't think it would
mm-hmm,
necessarily prepare you better than just having a grammar school education for being a playwright. And there
mm-hmm,
was a university play performed at St. John's College, Cambridge, called The Second Part to the Return of Parnassus, where you have the role of Will Kemp, not actually Will Kemp, but he delivers the line that few university educated men pen plays well, and our fellow Shakespeare puts them down all. And another thing, just to add, when I was going through my list of non-university educated playwrights, one of the most formidable playwrights in terms of learning was Ben Jonson, who was a real stickler for knowledge and a real stickler for detail. And he didn't go to university either, and he would often disparage Shakespeare. He would disparage everybody, actually.
sure. He was an insult comic, you know,
He and hilarious though.
and a good one, a very good one. But that's, if we kind of can wrap our brain around that, again, that he wasn't some sort of highfalutin
No,
intellectual. He was, you know, basically insulting his way, dissing people, from one end to the other. Um, uh, Something else that we can think about is that Oxford is between Stratford-on-Avon and London,
yeah,
and there is no there was no reason why Shakespeare couldn't have uh, attended plays there, attended lectures. Um,
yeah,
i- it's, just like today, if you want to sit in on a class,
yeah.
you just have to ask the instructor, and you can do that. So we don't know how much education he got. Uh,
Mm,
we don't know what he was doing for 10 years. And
mm,
so, was he just slinking around corners at Oxford? Could have been. Was he a deckhand and, going to Venice and to Paris and, checking out Commedia dell'arte and all of that, learning about ship's rigging so he could write about it later? We don't
mm.
know. What did he just have his hands full as a very young father of twins? Possibly. He could have done all of those things or none of those things. And so, uh, you know, we don't have to put imaginary limits on what
Mm.
he could or could not have known or done during that time. Uh,
There's a point worth making, mind, when it comes to this notion of having to have gone somewhere in order to be able to write about it. And when we have a look at many Elizabethan plays near the beginning of Shakespeare's career, you have the so-called Turk play,
mhm,
and you have plays set in exotic locations, Asia, Turkey, and so forth. Christopher Marlowe's Tamburlaine plays, George Peele's The Battle of Alcazar, plays by Robert Greene, Alphonsus, King of Aragon, Salimas, Thomas Kyd, Solomon, and Poseida. They were essentially drawing from source material, but
mhm.
they didn't necessarily have to have traveled the globe
No,
in order to set a play
no,
in a particular location.
no, no, definitely not. And, even today, people write about places they haven't been
Yeah.
all the time. And just just as now there were travel logs, there were people to talk to who had been in those places, and there were other forms of entertainment that Shakespeare and his contemporaries drew from on a regular basis. So, no, we don't have to think that Shakespeare invented all of this and all of these details on his own. In fact, we know that he didn't do that because, as you pointed out, the idea was not to come up with necessarily an original scenario or an original plot. The idea was to tell it in a new way, in an interesting way, and to use the language in such a way that it would dazzle, that it would delight. And this kind of remix culture is something that we do today, very much memes, parody songs, uh, you know, songs where people, sampling, uh, all of that is very much remix. Fan fiction is huge and, you know, still part of real literature. Like we can call that real literature because certainly Dante was writing fan fiction with a self-insert character and that is now classic literature. So I think maybe we can blur some of these lines of, not quite so compartmentalized. And then we can kind of open our mind to the idea that yes, of course he could have written these, and of course these other playwrights could have written these plays about places that they had never been. Uh, and that, there were it was such a rich cultural environment, London in this time period, because printing presses were new, because religious thought was opened up. People were expressing ideas that they would not have dared to even think, you know, 100 years previous. Uh, the it was a very fertile ground for coming up with new forms of language and with expressing things in new ways. So there were all kinds of texts that he could have drawn from, all kinds of subjects that people would have talked about, at the local tavern. Uh, there was alchemy and astrology, both very popular, very controversial subjects in some way at that time, just as they are now. There were the broadside ballads that we talked about last time, where these were ballads on one side and kind of the news of the day and silly stories and uh, jokes and stuff on the other side, printed and just kind of spread about, very cheap to buy. uh, so again, back to the literacy thing, there was plenty to read and there was plenty of stuff to learn to read for someone at any level. Uh, there were herbals, there were jest books, which were just books full of jokes. And maybe we'll talk about jest books another time because that's a whole
Yeah.
other that's a deep well, jest books. Uh, and of course, medicine. People were. Uh, there was a big shift at that point between the old Galen type of medicinal theory and Paracelsus. And so there was a lot of discussion about that, just in the same way today that, we compare traditional types of medicine with, other kinds of medicine. And people were very interested in this stuff, just like we are now. They were no different. Everybody wants to know how things work. Uh, let's see, what else have we got here? I think, oh, oh. And there was a tremendous variety in entertainment as well, right? You know, you could be inspired by a puppet show, by jousting tournaments by masks. He would have very likely seen mystery plays when
Mm,
he was a little boy before they were banned. So he had this incredible, rich cultural soup to draw from, as did all of his cohort.
mm,
So, you know, I think perhaps one thing that helps us get away from the idea of could he or could he not have written his plays is why wouldn't he when so many others were doing the same thing from varying backgrounds, uh, you know, different social standing, completely different life circumstances. Everybody was still writing plays regardless. So uh, I think that that's an important point that we sometimes put him on such a high pedestal
mm,
that it sounds like only somebody amazing could have learned all of those things, and that's not the case. Now, was he better at it than most? Obviously, because we're having this conversation now. The proof is in the pudding. So, yes, he's very good at it, but that doesn't mean that other people weren't treating the same subject matter with the same kind of depth and range that
mm.
that he was doing,
And,
as
and I
you
think
well know.
it was worth trying to get away from that isolative discourse with Shakespeare because
Mm-hmm.
during his time, yes, he was recognized as a wonderful poet, wonderful playwright, but one of several great playwrights that he would
Mm-hmm.
often be mentioned in the same breath as Francis Beaumont, John Fletcher, Ben Jonson. It was very much a communal enterprise,
Well,
playwriting.
and that's it, and we will follow that line in a moment, but uh, I think the idea of fame, like we have the idea that he must have been incredibly famous as a playwright
Mm,
in his time, and that's not what the evidence says. The evidence says that he was part of a company, that the plays he wrote were considered property of the company. In fact, when Henslow had to get the rights for all those plays to put in the folio, he could only do that because they belonged to the company. Uh,
mm,
you know, they were essentially belonged to the king's men at that point. And so when a play was published, unless you were Ben Jonson, who was arguably the most famous playwright of the age, would you say? Even if his plays weren't always very popular. I mean, I just think that as a person, as a celebrity, let's say, that
he was an entity, yes.
right. And
He was a pretty big figure.
Shakespeare was not so much. And that's all due to Ben Jonson and his talent for shameless self-promotion. Uh,
Mm.
he was good at that. It doesn't appear that Shakespeare had those same priorities.
And in
And
terms of his company,
yeah,
you can compare Shakespeare's fame or reputation to the leading actor in that company, the leading actor in the Lord Chamberlain's Men and King's Men, Richard Burbage. So when Shakespeare dies, it's fairly quiet in terms of
yeah.
contemporary documentary evidence. Whereas we know that when Richard Burbage died, the whole country was in mourning. So that star actor, very
No,
different in terms of the contemporary cultural impact in comparison to Shakespeare is the actor playwright of the company.
very much so. And Richard Burbage died right after Queen Anne had died.
Yeah, yeah,
And
1619. Yeah,
and I think it was James complained that
yeah.
that her that people were mourning more for Richard Burbage and that you know she was getting lost in the I'm going to say lost in the sauce. I guess that's fair.
Overshadowed in
Oh,
mourning.
that's a much better phrase. Thank you. Yes, overshadowed uh, by the mourning for Richard Burbage,
Mm,
which was apparently extensive weeping and wailing in the streets. So
mm,
Shakespeare didn't get any of that. And, this is one of those topics that oddly I find is contentious online, that I get a lot of pushback from people uh, claiming that, oh, yes, everybody must have known who he was. No,
mm,
no, not
mm,
everybody must have known who he was. Uh,
mm,
even today, like a very popular sitcom has a whole bunch of writers that work in a writer's room. And when an episode comes out, the writer's name flips by in the
mm,
credits. Let's face
mm,
it, most of us don't look at those. Most of us aren't paying attention to those. We're thinking of that as an episode in that show. And this was very much the way it seems like plays were then. These weren't episodes, but this was the latest production from
mm,
this company.
mm,
And it was understood that people worked collaboratively, that uh, that they had to work collaboratively in order to get a show off the ground.
mm,
And that is something that people even do today. Nobody writes a play in a vacuum. Nobody
mm.
goes up to their garret in the attic and, you know, imagines, some love story out of nothing. It, everything is a conversation with the past and a projection into the future of how you want to move those stories and those themes that you grew up with, that you're surrounded by, and transform them into something new. And I really don't think it was that different back then.
I think you see a shift when you're looking at play title pages in particular. That in the Elizabethan period, playing companies are more concerned with advertising themselves on those title pages than with advertising their authors. And then I think you get a shift, particularly in the Jacobean and Caroline periods, where printers and publishers start to recognize the saleability of a playwright's name. And it's worth emphasizing as well that plays during Shakespeare's time, they weren't considered works of art or great
Mhm.
literature in the same way that they are today. And that when Ben Jonson published his folio of plays in 1616, the works of Benjamin Jonson, he got quite a bit of stick for that. You had a poet named John Suckling say that Jonson deserves the bays, for his were called works, while others were but plays. But fundamentally, that Jonson folio,
Mhm.
that paved the way for plays to be seen as works of artistic literature. It paved the way for Shakespeare's 1623 first folio, and paved the way for other folio editions, such as the works of Beaumont and Fletcher, first printed in
Mhm.
1647, for example.
Well, because before that, folios were only printed after somebody's death, right?
Mm,
And they
mm.
were for uh, important topics.
History, religion,
Mm-hmm.
not
Mm-hmm.
not so much for plays. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's not like playwriting and actors had some sort of respect back
Mm,
then.
mm.
These were not, they might be lauded, but they weren't respected. And you didn't want your daughter to marry one. That, it was not not a
Uh,
reputable career. So, Darren, you're an actor and a writer, and how do you feel like that informs a playwright?
yes, yeah. So I've tread the boards. I have dabbled, and I think it was almost like a superpower for Shakespeare having that background as an actor, being an actor playwright. And we were talking about Shakespeare in comparison to other non-university educated playwrights.
Mhm.
There were a lot of playwrights who were also actors, We've mentioned several in previous episodes. When we were looking at fools, we mentioned Robert Wilson, an Elizabethan playwright, Samuel Rowley, who often played rather politically incorrect term today, fat clown roles. Ben Jonson. So Ben Jonson was initially a bricklayer, and then we have rather acerbic accounts from his playwright rival, Thomas Dekker, who gives us the image of him in a leather pilch, strolling next to a traveling wagon, playing the role of Hieronymo in Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy. Nathan Field, great playwright, often collaborated with the likes of John Fletcher and Philip Massenger, seems to have started off playing female roles primarily. So it was perfectly normal to be an actor playwright, to have those dual roles. And I found it interesting. Several years ago, there was an article in the media which was concerning an argument I had made about some of the roles that Shakespeare might have taken as an actor. And some of the comments online were interesting in that they sort of said, oh, well, he wouldn't have wanted to do too much acting, that would have been beneath him. And I just find that a really interesting perspective when we go back to that reaction to Richard Burbage's death, that reaction to the star actor. But we have this image of the playwright being this great figure and acting being below him. But Shakespeare acted for much, if not all, of his playwriting career, I would suggest. So we don't know any specific role he took. You have the poet John Davis of Hereford say that he often played kingly parts in sport. So he might have played some of the monarchical roles in his plays. There are traditions that he played the role of the old man Adam in As You Like It, that he played the role of the ghost in Hamlet, which I really do like that idea. We know that he acted in some of Ben Jonson's plays. So we know through cast lists in the Johnson Folio that he performed in the comedy of Every Man in His Humour in 1598 and in Sejanus in 1603. So Shakespeare acting for much of his career, and is, of course, maligned as an actor who has dared to turn his hand to writing plays in the 1592 pamphlet, Green's Groat's Worth of Wit. But I think what's great about Shakespeare and what distinguishes him from a writer like Robert Greene, to whom that pamphlet has been attributed, is that he's deeply actor conscious. And he knows the strengths and limitations of his playing company. And he knows, for example, that he's writing for apprentices, these young boys playing female roles. And we often think of Shakespeare today as this great poet. And a beautiful poetic line that springs to mind is in Romeo and Juliet, when Romeo gazes up at Juliet in her window and says, "See how she leans her cheek upon her hand." That is beautiful poetry, but it's also a cue. It's guiding that young boy playing Juliet to lean his cheek upon his hand. So I think for Shakespeare, being an actor, performing in his own plays as well as the plays of other writers, that gives him first-hand experience of various playing spaces and what works and what doesn't necessarily work for audiences. And he's deeply audience conscious as well. He's got a particularly imagistic verse, and his plays would have been performed at 2 PM. And Shakespeare, very pragmatic writer, I think, very much a man of the theatre. When you think of the opening to a play like Hamlet, for example, who's there? Simple interrogative, 2 words opening that great tragedy. And we could say, oh, this is existential. What is there beyond the veil of death? But I think that that's serving a practical purpose. If a character's asking, who's there, it establishes right from the start, 2 p.m. in the afternoon at the Globe Playhouse, potentially sunlight spilling down on the audience. That visibility is an issue. It's probably dark, and we learn shortly later it is indeed midnight. And that question, who's there, crops up a lot in Macbeth as well, 2/3 of which are set at night. So I think it really helps Shakespeare that he is a very practical man of the theatre. I get the sense he even knows how long it takes to wash up stage blood when you have the intervention of the porter, for example, in Macbeth. The Macbeths have just committed regicide, murdered King Duncan, and then the porter interposes with his plebeian humour. And also going back to Hamlet, Shakespeare, I think, knows when his actors need a rest. He knows when Richard Burbage has been waffling for quite a long time in various scenes and is making his way through 7 soliloquies. I'd tell you what, let's send Hamlet off to England at this point. Let's just give him a little bit of a break. So Shakespeare, very much a practical man of the theatre. You read his plays, these are not the products of a highfalutin ivory tower figure or a member of the aristocracy. These are very much the products of a man who knows theatre and his fellow company members and his audiences intimately. And something I've written quite a lot on is when we're thinking about Shakespeare's sources and influences, that we have this romantic image of him at his writing table with a great tome before him, which is certainly the case, I think, in the case when it comes to history plays, when he's got the likes of Holinshed in front of him. But you find that Shakespeare's plays, particularly his early plays, sometimes they read like patchworks of phrases you will also find in the likes of Thomas Kyd or Christopher Marlowe or George Peele, that as an actor, you need an incredible memory. So it goes back to that emphasis on memorization and improvisation at grammar school. You're performing 6 days a week. You're probably doubling roles. You're performing in multiple plays. You've got your lines and just a couple of words from preceding speeches. And sometimes a play that you performed months or even years ago gets revived. So you need to summon those lines up from the cellarage of your mind. And I think Shakespeare, whether consciously or subconsciously, he's often echoing earlier plays. I get the sense he's often gazing wistfully at past dramas for inspiration. And he always does something a little bit different. He will change up the context of a verbal echo. And it goes back to that notion of doing something different, bettering your sources, your inspirations, or bettering your instruction, as Shylock might put it. So I think it was really valuable for Shakespeare being an actor, playwright, and it does distinguish him from some of those university-educated playwrights you see at the beginning of his career. Read Robert Greene's, what is considered his first play, Alphonsus, King of Aragon, and you get the sense there's a man who's never stood on a stage before. So some of the stage directions he gives for the players inadvertently patronizing, I think. But Shakespeare is very sensitive to his fellow company members. And I really like the idea of him potentially playing the ghost or potentially playing Adam. So Adam is a character who guides the protagonist Orlando into the Forest of Arden in As You Like It. So he serves a really interesting structural purpose, I think. And the ghost of Hamlet's father is the very impetus for the tragedy. He is the structural fulcrum. So very useful roles for an actor playwright to perform who is guiding his fellow actors with limited rehearsal time, potentially just a few days or maybe several weeks to put up a play like Hamlet, for example. So that's how I see Shakespeare. I don't see him as this poet laureate figure on a pedestal. I see him as a practical man of the theatre and a great creative. And I think it was incredibly important that he was an actor playwright. And I feel that's something that often gets forgotten today.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And when I was directing Shakespeare, it became really clear to me how much direction he gives in the
Yeah,
text. And
yeah,
I think it spoils you for
yeah,
directing anything else because it's all right there.
yeah,
It's all right there in the text what's happening. Oh, why do you, cross to that window? It's like,
yeah, yeah.
oh, okay. Oh, I have stabbed someone behind in a rass. Okay. Everything is laid out so cleanly. And I think that that's the kind of thing that you really don't get to appreciate unless you have performed or directed Shakespeare in some way and then
Mm,
compared it to another playwright.
mm,
And I think that's part of the reason why his work is still so popular today. And,
mm,
your point is well taken that it was to help, you know, busy actors of varying levels of skill, uh, pick pick something up quickly and run with it. Um,
mm,
and I think that it's a if if he was a genius, I think it lies in that ability, in his ability to communicate very clearly to his fellow
mm,
actors what he wanted and
mm,
to create a sort of smorgasbord
mm,
of presentations of meaning. He's got so many lists, right? He's very fond of
mm,
lists. And you can just picture, okay, they've got this company, they're going all through the countryside. Every single county has a different dialect. Somehow they've got to find a way to communicate to all these different people with one language. Uh,
mm.
what's going on.
That I like what you were saying about Shakespeare being this sensitive writer. So he strikes me as more audience conscious than a lot of playwrights,
Hmm.
and he's very conscious of not alienating audiences. So you will find in university educated playwrights such as Christopher Marlowe or Robert Greene that they will often hit you with a load of classical references and that
Mm-hmm.
they name particular mythological figures. Whereas I think Shakespeare's conscious of not doing that too much, not alienating the audiences, drawing attention to a classical allusion without necessarily explicating the name. And people get frustrated by Shakespeare because they find him elusive. They want to know who was this man, what were his particular views, and what were his ideologies. But the fact that he was a great actor, playwright, he's
Mm-hmm.
accustomed to inhabiting all sorts of different roles, giving voice to very different characters. And I think that's why his works endure more than in the case of a writer like Ben Jonson.
Yeah.
Ben Jonson, yes, he's presenting individualized characters, but my goodness, you hear the voice of Ben Jonson and you
Yes.
certainly get a sense of what his opinions are. But there's an interpretive malleability to Shakespeare, which I think makes him great for study, great on the page, but also, as you point out, really great on the stage. And we're almost spoiled by
Mm-hmm.
Shakespeare's plays if you're putting them up on their feet. And that's something I often say to young people who can be a little bit intimidated by
Mm-hmm.
the language at first glance is dig a little deeper. You'll see that actually Shakespeare is a wonderful guide. And in the case of roles such as your Juliets, your Ophelias, your Cleopatras, your Rosalinds, that he's writing for people of your age. He's
He
writing for
is.
teenagers
It's
and
true.
he's guiding them and he can guide you today in the 21st century.
That that's very true. It's not. Uh, he wasn't writing to show off.
No.
He was writing to sell tickets, and he seems to have been very politically apt in that he didn't and this is sheer conjecture on my part, but that he didn't let his ego get in
mm,
the way of one, telling a good story, and two, his personal safety,
mm,
because so many of his fellow playwrights came to a bad end.
mm,
And I think a lot of the time they were showing off.
mm, mm,
Uh, they were being defiant, or they were, trying to prove that they were that much smarter than their fellow playwright or whatever. And,
mm.
that kind of sort of ego topping
Yeah.
can really get you out on a limb pretty darn quickly, into a space where you don't even realize that you're at risk necessarily. But
Mm,
and obviously it didn't matter how successful or popular you were. Christopher Marlowe and Thomas Kidd both came to very bad ends.
mm,
And we talk about it kind of glibly now, but it would be as if Steven Spielberg and Stephen King,
mm,
both got accused of treason.
mm,
That's how big of a deal that was at the time. So I think, you know, Shakespeare really has a skill for self-preservation,
mm,
and that a lot of what frustrates us in terms of we want to see the man, we want to know what the man thought. That was risky, that was
mm,
dangerous,
mm,
to let people know what you thought all the time. Uh, I think too that, in this internet age, we know what everybody thinks about everything. And, uh, not to get all, old days were better days, because I don't believe that. But, when I was a young lass before the internet, I didn't know all the opinions of all my neighbors and all my family and all my friends. Like, those sort of deep opinions came out, sometimes with a glass of wine around a campfire or something. I- People sort of parceled these things out a lot more.
mm,
And I think for better or worse, that made for more social cohesion. That
mm,
made it for easier political alliances in a way, easier for people to agree to all do the same thing at the same time. And, we can picture that kind of almost on steroids during this time in London, because uh, there were spies everywhere.
mm,
You know, we worry about being spied on digitally now, as we are constantly. We know we are. But the same thing was true back then. Spies were
mm,
everywhere. And there was a lot to be gained by having information that was important to somebody. People were always listening for that kind of thing. And so, Shakespeare made it, to not a very old age, what, 53 or something, um,
do,
52, 53, uh, didn't go to prison, didn't get tortured, didn't get exiled. Um, as far as we know, didn't murder anybody. I mean, this is, and it didn't go bankrupt. I mean,
mm.
and that doesn't seem like a lot to ask until you read about his cohort, uh,
Well,
where those things often happened.
yeah, and it's a really important point you make with regards to the tragic end of so many of these playwrights, that so many of them died impoverished. So many
Yeah.
of them have their estates renounced by their family, or by their widows. The likes of your George Peels, your
Hmm.
Thomas Deckers, and so
Hmm.
on. I think one thing that frustrates people today is the mendacity of what survives in terms of documentation about Shakespeare. That there's a bit of tax dodging, or there's a little bit of malt hoarding. and people say, oh, why would this genius, uh, why would he be dealing in malt or wool brogging or selling gloves? And the fact of the matter is that you talked about Shakespeare's self-preservation.
Mm.
You had to spin an awful lot of plates to keep your head above water. And that's what Shakespeare was doing, that he's dealing
You
in
needed a
all of
lot of side gigs,
the,
a lot of
and he's
side
an
gigs.
actor and a shareholder
Hmm.
as well. So he was certainly a businessman,
Very much
Shakespeare,
so.
and by necessity, it's the kind of business side of Shakespeare that survives outside of the literature, and that doesn't
Hmm.
necessarily give you insights into his creativity, but it does give you insights into his self-preservation, the fact that he died and wasn't impoverished, and he
Yeah.
was he was fairly wealthy actually, and he was a gentleman.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, he made some very savvy real estate deals.
Yeah.
And as prosaic as that is, it does it does bespeak a kind of strategic intelligence
Mm,
that you can apply to the way that he structures his plays. And it's not just so much like I love Midsummer Night's Dream for so many reasons, but I love its sort of uh, book structure in that it, you know, everything that starts in kind of the first half of the play is mirrored in the second half of the play. It's all sort of very symmetrical in structure, and I don't think he does that very often with his plays, but it shows that he was thinking about that and that that was a choice that he made and that he is continuing to make choices in the way that he structures all of his plays.
mm,
Hamlet is like Sisyphus dropped his boulder and it just runs downhill and it just keeps going and going and going until it finally, crashes into the ocean. Like it really never stops tumbling downhill. And
mm,
I don't think that was an accident. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. And the
mm,
fact that each play is structured so differently, uh,
mm,
again, is uh, another clue that we're dealing with somebody who was thinking strategically and that was constantly surprising his audience by,
yes.
you know, coming up
Yeah.
with a new structure.
He's a great entertainer, and something that doesn't necessarily leap from the page is that notion of pacing. But
Hmm.
Othello is an example that stands out to me, that you are waiting for that inevitable tragic
Yes.
denouement. You're waiting for Othello to enter the bedroom chamber, and Shakespeare gives you the Willow Song. So he's inverting a ballad there where Desdemona is speaking about this song in which a female laments being deserted by her lover. And then Desdemona stops the song and says, "Oh, is there a knocking at the chamber door?"
Mm.
And I think Amelia says, "No, it's just the wind." So you're building up that tension as Shakespeare has slowed the drama right down, and then we do come to the moment when Othello enters the bedroom chamber, and he doesn't go in and uh, beat Desdemona with sand-filled stockings, as in Shakespeare's Source Cinthio. He delivers this beautiful, eloquent speech. It is the cause, my soul. It's a moment of beautiful poetry, but it's the suspension of dramatic action. And that for me is very much an actor playwright, that he knows
Mm.
pacing inside out. He knows how to get his audiences craning their necks, maybe sitting on the edge of their seats. Not if you're a smelly groundling, of course.
Othello, I always feel like I'm holding my breath
Yes.
watching the whole play. And
Yeah.
then, the fact that it ends with an absence of breath, uh,
Yeah.
it feels so profound that you can finally start breathing when Desdemona has stopped breathing. Um,
Mm.
and there's probably a whole other book in that we could write about the structure of his plays and how well they fit the particular plot, the particular
Mm,
story that he's telling, and how this is, clearly conscious choices that he's
mm,
making about how he's going to write those plays.
mm.
Um, so, um, something that you've spent a good chunk of your life doing is figuring out who wrote what plays. Uh, how do we know when Shakespeare was writing something versus when, uh, one of his co-workers was writing something and it's all mixed up in the play?
Mm.
And that's really fascinating to me. So, how does that work?
Yeah, well, and it's very important the fact that Shakespeare did co-author plays, that he did
Hmm.
collaborate, and this is perfectly normal if you are a commercial dramatist. That pretty
Yes.
much every single dramatist writing for the public playhouses occasionally co-authored plays, and I think there's a degree of economic necessity when you're working freelance that you could get paid quicker potentially
Hmm.
if you're co-writing a play. You can produce play scripts more quickly in order to service that commercial operation, but collaboration could also be broadening, that you could produce a play co-written with another writer, or potentially within a team of writers that you wouldn't necessarily be able to produce on your own, that you're all
Yes.
bringing something a little bit different to the table. So Shakespeare seems to have collaborated with other playwrights primarily at the beginning,
Mm.
with plays like Titus Andronicus, co-written with George Peele, or The Reign of King Edward III, most likely co-written with Thomas Kidd. And towards the end of his career, particularly with the younger contemporary John Fletcher, plays such as The Two Noble Kinsmen, the Quarto, the 1634 edition of that play attributed to Shakespeare and John Fletcher, The Lost Cardenio, as well as Henry VIII, or All Is
Mhm.
True. So Shakespeare is just like every other commercial dramatist in that respect, that we have some external evidence, but primarily internal evidence that in the cases of several of his plays, he's writing with the likes of Peele, Thomas Kidd, George Wilkins, Thomas Middleton, John Fletcher, and so on. So, how do you work that out in terms of internal evidence? Well, if you go back to the 19th century, you had scholars primarily focusing on the John Fletcher canon, because Fletcher was a deeply collaborative dramatist. And they pointed out differences in verse style between different passages, different scenes. And you can see that when Shakespeare arrives on the scene, uh, in comparison to the university educated playwrights like your Christopher Marlowe's, your Robert Greene's, and your George Peele's, he has some linguistic flexibility. Those playwrights largely stick to the 10-syllable line, whereas Shakespeare often incorporates an 11th syllable, the so-called feminine ending, which I think is a slightly sexist term, but there
Sure.
you go. But what's quite interesting is as his career progresses, you have Jacobean playwrights incorporating the feminine ending much more frequently, to the extent I think that 11 syllable lines become the norm as opposed to 10 syllable lines. So
Interesting.
in his later plays, you can distinguish his writing from John Fletcher's, because Fletcher has a much higher rate for feminine endings. And early scholars also focused on particular images, particular favorite phrases that playwrights had. And that was a form of qualitative analysis, that you had some scholars who were deeply read and really attuned to differences in authorial style. And you can quantify particular phrases these days using electronic corpora. So you can identify a playwright based on how many unique phrases they incorporate in their plays. Phrases that appear in no other plays, just in their particular corpus. And I think a plurality of approaches is necessary in order to build up a strong case for common authorship. So you might also look at authorial preferences for particular forms. So John Fletcher, for example, likes to use EM, so apostrophe EM, as opposed to them. John Fletcher frequently uses ye rather than you or thou. So when you put all that evidence together in terms of vocabulary, in terms of prosodic analysis, versification analysis, phraseological analysis, and also such approaches as authors' favorite rhyming patterns, their dramaturgical preferences. I think if you can combine the qualitative with quantitative analysis, you can make a pretty strong case for common authorship, and you can identify who is contributing what in terms of co-authored plays.
So how does that work in a practical sense? Do you run it through a computer program? Are you looking for certain things? Do you have a list in your head? What does that look like when you're sitting down? Because from out here, it just looks like magic, but I know there's a lot of just kind of, labor behind it.
Yeah, and I'm very wary of this notion of just running a text through a computer.
Mm-hmm.
So treating these literary and performative artifacts as mere text to be number crunched. But there was a review of my book Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers where the reviewer implied that Darren clearly loves spreadsheets, which I don't necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
But one database I use it's called Collocations and N-grams, and it's developed by a software engineer named Pervez Rizvi, who's also a superb Shakespeare scholar. And what's great about that database is that you could download spreadsheets, that they will rank plays in terms of shared phrases. And we now know, as scholars from the late 19th century pointed out, that authors do habitually repeat themselves, and that a play written by the same author will contain more phrasal repetitions than plays by two different authors, for example. So you can have these spreadsheets ranking plays according to phrases. But what I love about that database in particular is that you can also download spreadsheets where it will put the shared phrases next to each other. So you've got two passages in two different plays, and they might share a particular unique phrase, but you can then read those passages in context. So you could see similarities in terms of scenic context or characterization, that you're not going to be ill at these numbers, because I think that the reading is fundamental. And there are so many different approaches. I mentioned prosodic analysis. There was a scholar in the 1960s named Aanstad who counted punctuation in plays. And punctuation is, as we know, not necessarily down to the playwrights,
Right.
but a lot of plays follow the rhythmical climate of the period. And he produced something called frequency polygons. So it looks a little bit like a cardiogram. And it's so fascinating that plays by the same dramatists, even if they were produced by different publishers or printers, they often follow the same pattern. So I've spent entire weekends, you say, how does it look? To you, it just looks like magic. I spent entire weekends hunched over playtext, counting punctuation, which if you enjoy that kind of thing, I do. And the more I think about it, when I went to university, there was a lot of emphasis on critical theory, and I didn't really get on with critical theory. I found it quite ethereal.
Yeah.
And I wonder if my interest in textual studies and authorship attribution, whether that was in some way a subconscious rebellion against critical theory, because while you can't definitively prove anything without
Mhm.
documentary evidence. And sometimes the documentary evidence is erroneous in terms of title page ascriptions or entries in the stationer's register. You can produce a portfolio of evidence and you can say,
Mhm.
this is my conclusion, this is my hypothesis, and you can present that to the scholarly community. So I wonder if that sense of authorship attribution studies being tangible, maybe that is in some way me rebelling against my undergraduate studies.
Well, I don't blame you at all for that because, uh, I was very frustrated in a similar way. I started out as an art student, and
Mm,
this was way back, in like the 80s, and representational art was considered just commercial. Like you would get a bad grade if you produced representational art in some classes. You're taking
mm,
a life drawing class, uh, that's different. You're drawing what's in front of you. And so representationalism and just kind of the tangible world was almost kind of looked down on for decades in education, which is a shame. And then
mm,
when I went to graduate school much later in the early aughts, there was, at that point, critical theory had just completely gripped the theater world.
yeah.
And, I just found it all, uh, I don't, just kind of like an exercise, like just this sort of mental exercise that people were doing, but that didn't lead anywhere. And so I just went in the opposite direction in terms of material history, which is
Mm,
what I'd always been fascinated with. How were these people living? What were their day-to-day concerns? And how does that get reflected into what they created? And I think we're seeing a movement towards that overall. I think we are finally seeing a shift away from abstract expressionism and
mm,
critical theory where we're supposed to take on these different lenses and view a piece of work through that particular lens in order to
mm,
be able to say anything meaningful about it. Uh,
mm,
but at the time when I was in graduate school, uh, we were supposed to take one play and apply different critical theories to it. And
mm,
I wanted to do Midsummer Night's Dream, which everybody was, scandalized by. They wanted me to do some Pinter play or something. I was like, no, I really want to do this. And so they finally relented and let me do it. And I was like, oh, they why can't I just do a close reading of this play in the context of the time? But no, they wanted me to apply all these different theories to it. So now I'm applying, a ecological theory lens to, Titania's speech about, the weather going bad and everything because she and Oberon are arguing, and then we're getting into Bottom and his change, and I'm like, well, furry theory says. So it,
mm,
it actually turned into something that I ended up enjoying in spite of myself by
mm,
not taking it too seriously. And
mm,
I do have to say that there were things I learned from that process, but
mm,
not nearly as much as I learned from
mm.
studying the context of the time and the place in which these plays were created. And,
Yeah.
it's fun. It's fun counting commas. It's fun, um, making herbal potions or figuring out how something would have been staged or, uh, you know, these are enjoyable pursuits. And I'm sure there must be people who enjoy critical theory. I have not met any, quite
Oh,
honestly. You know,
oh. Oh, no, I've met a lot, and
have
I'm
you
not.
really?
Oh yes, yeah. People who love critical theory, and it was all the rage at university when I started as an undergraduate,
Yeah.
2007. And I'm not dissing critical theory, but it wasn't really for me. I like to be able
Hmm.
to reach a conclusion and to feel that what I'm working on is tangible, and I don't like to limit my analysis of a
Right.
play to a
Right.
particular lens. And that applies when I'm talking about authorship attribution techniques as well, that you will have some scholars say, this is the definitive
Hmm.
method, function word analysis, where we're going to count the frequencies of and
Hmm.
or of, and this will determine who wrote what. And I think that's really not the right way to go, that you need as many different methods as possible in order to build a robust case for common authorship.
Well, it sounds like we were going through similar things at about the same time. That,
Yeah.
because I started graduate school in 2008.
Oh
So,
wow.
um, yeah, we were both struggling.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It was
It
all the
took me
rage. It was all
a
the
long time
rage.
to find my voice. I think
Pardon?
uh, it took me a long time to find my voice as an undergraduate.
Did it?
I think in terms of essay writing, and
Hmm.
it's a smorgasbord, isn't it? You're sampling all different topics that, I was doing modules on critical theory, and then Victorian literature over here, and Alfred Hitchcock over there, which I loved actually. And it kind of reminds me of what I was saying about Erasmus encouraging students to read every type of author
Hmm.
in order to fill up your store. I think you need to approach text through all sorts of different lenses and see which lens works best for you.
That is such a good point because I really encourage people, instead of feeling like, oh, they have to absorb this completely new and different thing, start where you are.
Mm,
So, uh, maybe gardening is your thing. Well, there, there's so much in Shakespeare that has to do with gardens and plants and farming
oh
and
yeah.
flowers and uh, just whatever string you can pull that you can reach, then pull that one and go that way. Don't feel like all of a sudden you need to learn Latin or something, because that's
Yeah.
not at all. And again, he wrote these plays to be approachable by as
Mm,
many people as possible. So, take advantage of that. Don't
mm.
feel don't feel intimidated.
It's tricky, isn't it? Where the world's at today, and the education system. We're talking a lot about the education system at the
Hmm.
start of this video, but I will often have students from all over the world will contact me and say, I want to do an MA or I want to do a PhD
Mm.
and I want to do it on Shakespeare, but I'm looking for a gap in the market. What is there not that much literature on? And my advice is always, especially if you're going to do a PhD, start with your passion. Start with what you're
Yeah.
genuinely interested in. Don't start by looking for the gaps. Start by looking at what impassions you and go from there. Because if you're going to commit to something like a PhD, for example, you really need to be passionate about it. I
It,
loved my PhD. My PhD was on authorship attribution. It was looking at Thomas Kyd's relationship with Shakespeare. And I got to think about Thomas Kyd and Shakespeare every day for 3 to 4 years. Now, if I had been doing a PhD on Foucault or Derrida, I imagine my response would have been a little bit different because they're not necessarily for me.
right. And it needs to sustain you
Yeah.
through some very difficult experiences. Academia is not a friendly place. It's a very, very difficult environment. And, if you think about the way people get harassed online, it's kind of like that on steroids. It's in many ways not a healthy environment and not a healthy way for people to live. So
mm,
you really have to be in love with your topic to see it
mm,
through. I don't know about you, but I barely made it through.
mm,
And I was uh, pushing 50, uh, very strong sense of self.
mm,
At that point in my life, I knew who I was and what I wanted to do. And still, um, the sheer abuse of the system and the people in it who feel entitled to behave
mm,
badly. It's
mm,
rife through academia.
mm.
For a while I thought, well, maybe it's just my university, and it's not. It's not.
Oh no.
It's as old as the hills, and goes back to, I believe, this grammar school model where children were beaten,
Mm,
where learning was seen as a punitive thing, where
mm,
you had to prove that you were worthy of your degree
mm,
by going through this gauntlet.
mm.
And yeah, don't pick something because you think there's a gap in the market, because number one, it's Shakespeare. It's not, it's not a new app. Um, Gaps in the market don't matter. Um, you know, we're going to be lucky, really lucky in a graduate program to find five other people who care about our topic
Mm,
at
mm,
all, let alone as much as we do. So it's it's not an end, it's definitely a path. And
mm,
how you trod that path, what you get on the way can give you tools once you're out of there. But
yeah.
but for heaven's sake, if anyone is watching this considering going to graduate school, and I haven't scared you off already, uh, you know, understand that this is how you will make connections, how you will figure out what you want to do after you get out of school. It's
Mm,
not going to necessarily uh, give you a clear path just by doing a particular topic. In fact, I think it's pretty common. You're definitely an exception, but it's pretty common that after people go through a whole graduate school, that they're like, well, I never want to deal with that topic again. And
oh gosh, I remember the day after my graduation, I was working on the canon of John Marston. Just because I said to myself, "Don't stop. If you take a break,
did you?
you'll,
Yeah.
you'll lose
Well,
you'll
see,
lose."
because you loved what you were doing,
I love it. Yeah,
and
yeah.
you still
No,
do,
I
and that's wonderful.
I have had. I was giving a talk in Stratford upon Avon a couple of years ago to MA students, and one of them said, "Oh, I'm interested in authorship attribution studies.
Hmm.
I'm thinking, I'm thinking that's the field I want to go in." Now, when I started delving into authorship attribution studies, I had no idea just what a quagmire it can be, and just how vitriolic it can be. And this student just said, what would your main advice be if you're going to go into this particular field? And my response was, put on some armor.
Yeah, exactly.
My goodness, it's a field that
Exactly.
it's weathered me. It's
Though, what I've found, and this has been true no matter uh, what realm I was working in, that just expressing an opinion, just putting your head up above a parapet,
mm,
makes you a target.
mm,
And, uh, sometimes I can say something that seems incredibly benign.
mm,
I was in one of the Shakespeare groups in Facebook, and, as I mentioned before, brought up the thing about fame, about
mm,
how he wasn't a celebrity.
Mm,
that he was well known in the theater community, extremely well known in the theater community. But in terms of Greater London and certainly England, he wasn't a celebrity on the order of Ben Jonson or Richard Burbage. I got
mm,
called names,
mm, mm,
you know, and basically, had my entire education, questioned, and, basically told that I should never even expound, on such a topic again. And to the point of ludicrousness. So, um,
mm.
I've been on the internet a long time, and
Yeah, yeah.
again, I'm not a spring chicken, so it's hard to uh, it's hard to offend me in that sense or to upset me, to undermine my self-confidence in that situation. Uh,
Mm.
but I do lose patience in
Yeah, yeah.
terms of, look, I came here just because this was a Shakespeare group, and I thought this was an interesting factoid.
Mm.
But some people see that as a challenge. And I had this one woman um, arguing with me. It was about a different topic, arguing with me. And finally, I said, listen, I appreciate your passion on the topic. I'm always incredibly polite because it frustrates the heck out of them. But, I appreciate your passion on this topic, but we're going around in circles. I'm going to have to end this discussion now. Thank you for the discussion. Um, she sent me a private message.
Mm.
And I said, why is this so important to you that I be wrong about that? And she said, oh, well, I'm a lawyer.
All right. It reminds me of a great line in Henry the Sixth Part Two. First thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers.
And I said, well, you know what Shakespeare thought about lawyers, don't you? And she said, no. And I said, oh, well, it's worth a look-see. I didn't want to put that in the DM and then get accused of
Mm,
threatening her. That's how that's how cagey I feel like we have to be in these
mm,
situations. And so I admire Shakespeare for his reticence, for his ability to kind of get rid of his tracks. Now,
yeah.
I'm sure, um, had the Bodleian Library thought that Shakespeare ephemera was important when it was available, then we would know a lot more about him. But
Mm,
nonetheless, he clearly had a skill
mm,
to remove his tracks of his personal opinions in his work. And the
mm.
reason that I can say that comfortably without any qualifiers is because we are still arguing about it today.
Yes. Yeah.
So, huzzah. Good job, Shakespeare. So, we've kind of wandered a little bit. We've started ranting about academia, but
I think the moral of the story is Rachel saying, YouTube commenters, bring it on.
well, it would be actually more provoking if we said, you better not say anything. That's the way
And
to.
this is a topic that people get very fierce about. That you get
Mhm.
people who are, really, really determined to prove that
It's like Richard the Third.
Michael
There's,
Fenn didn't have written these plays or
yeah,
poems. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, to my mind, to just put it very simply, there was nobody else as well placed to write Shakespeare's plays as Shakespeare. He
Mm,
was there. We know he
mm,
was there.
mm,
We know he was part of these companies. We know
mm,
that the companies produced those plays. We
mm,
know that the way plays were produced at that time were in a way that Shakespeare had the opportunity to write them and help produce them. So
mm,
anybody else who could have conceivably written those plays. And I want to be clear. First of all, let me confess something that when I went to graduate school, when I started graduate school in 2008, I'd been on the internet for a long time. And at that point, the internet had decided, along with Mark Twain, that Shakespeare had not written his plays. And I went into graduate school thinking that.
Mm,
And one of the first classes, we were talking about Shakespeare, and these people were talking about Shakespeare as if he had written his plays. And
mm,
for once in my freaking life, I did not say any, I didn't say, oh, but we all know he didn't write his plays. And I am so thankful that I can uh, hold up my head and that there was at least one time when I was discreet about a questionable opinion and
mm,
open to what these people had to say. So, I kind of brush aside charges of like, oh, well, you just want to believe that he wrote. No, I did not think that he wrote his plays. I was,
mm,
horribly influenced by the internet at that point,
mm,
and, did my own due diligence in terms of looking at, okay, maybe I'm wrong. And all I ask is that if you have a strong opinion about Shakespeare not writing his plays, that you be at least as I don't want to say smart, but open-minded, you know, to the fact that people are wrong sometimes. The internet is wrong sometimes, and that when you have the luxury of really looking into who could have written these plays in this time, there just isn't anybody else that comes
mm.
close to have the means, the method, and the opportunity. So I guess I'm answering our final verdict, which is,
Yeah,
you know,
it's often called taboo, isn't it? To question Shakespeare's authorship, and I don't think it's taboo. That's not my
I don't think
response
so.
when I'm
No,
rolling my eyes into the back
no,
of my head. I think the fact of the matter is, and this is my verdict, there's a good reason why historians don't generally doubt that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare,
yeah.
is there's ample historical evidence. And if you, and I hope we've helped viewers and listeners here, if you have a real sense of the historical context, as Rachel says, Shakespeare was very well placed to write Shakespeare.
All right. So, shall we move on to Writer's Corner now?
Yes, I haven't been doing too much writing since the last episode we recorded.
Mhm.
I'm still chipping away at Shakespeare and Panto. And before you ask, no, publisher not confirmed yet. But I'm focusing at the moment on woods and forests in
Nice.
Shakespeare, um, and just that sense of transformation, for better or for worse,
Hmm.
when you go down to the woods in a Shakespeare play, and comparing that in a figurative and in a literal
Yeah.
on-stage sense to woods in pantomimes. And I was particularly interested in something you were saying in a previous episode where you were talking about Birnam Wood rebelling against Macbeth.
Oh, yeah.
I'd be interested just to get a little bit more your thinking about that, and I will duly acknowledge you, of course.
Well, you know, back in Celtic times, and I'm using that term broadly, uh, there was this idea of land sovereignty, that you joined with the land in a relationship, and that a king or queen was wedded to their land. And Elizabeth the First capitalizes on this by saying that she's basically married to England. And this kind of builds on this old idea that the monarch was in a, romantic marital relationship with the land itself, and that's what made them qualified to rule. Um, it's like, well, of course I can speak for my spouse, right? Uh, and so that's kind of in a way, uh, I don't want to say older, but at that time period, um, that was kind of a more dominant way of thinking about it, an older way of thinking about it, as opposed to anointed kingship, where, you know, uh, a God on high said, "Yeah, that's the one for me. That one." And so when we get to the Tudors and the Stuarts, we're really dealing with an anointed monarchy that also, in Elizabeth's case, because she wasn't married to a human person, had to reach back to that idea about sovereignty. But, by the time James came along, he was married, he had a queen, and he needed to go the anointed route because his actual ties to royalty in terms of as a royal line, a little sketchy when it comes right down to it. I won't go too deep into that. But in Macbeth, Macbeth has violated all these taboos,
Mm,
and the land rises against him. But
mm,
Shakespeare does this really clever thing where he makes that do double duty, right?
mm,
He says, okay, sure, the land is rising against him, but actually, it's a bunch of guys with trees,
mm,
you know, moving on the king. And so, Macbeth is condemned by the symbolism of the land, and he's also condemned by the fact that all these guys want to kill him. They want to see they want to see him dead. But I think it's interesting that woods and pastorals in general are
mm,
often treated as this sort of nexus uh, between the physical tangible world and this invisible um, kind of amorphous world that's kind of not Christian. Um, we see that again and again. We see that in Midsummer, and we see that in quite a few plays. As You Like It, right? And
oh yeah.
um,
But what I find interesting is bit of a generalization, but particularly in the comedies, it's often considered you have the court, and there's
hmm
often moral decay, and there's corruption, and then you have the woods, which uh,
hmm
often utopian or offer opportunities for transformation. And I just find it very interesting in that tragic context, because I was thinking about Birnam Wood coming to Dunsinane Castle
mm,
in terms of a play that Shakespeare co-wrote with Thomas Middleton about a year after Macbeth, which is Timon of Athens,
hmm
where Timon goes from being a philanthropist to a misanthrope, and he goes into the forest and he finds gold while he's digging for
right.
roots, and he uses that gold as a means of uh, rebelling, I guess,
Yes.
or you could say the destruction of the
hmm
city of Athens. And I just find that really interesting, that notion of the woods providing a corrective for the corruption of
Mm,
the court or the Commonwealth. And it's very interesting that Shakespeare's exploring that in the space of about a year or two. 1606, we think Macbeth written, 1607, Timon of Athens. So that was the path that I was
that's
exploring recently,
interesting.
chipping away
Yeah.
at Shakespeare's canto.
That's really interesting, especially when we consider that, we have a very romantic idea of nature in
Mm,
this century, because most of us are city dwellers.
mm,
And, back then, they would not have thought of nature as always a good thing.
No.
It was a scary thing. It was a dangerous thing. Obviously not so much in London or even in England, where by then all the wolves had been, eliminated. Like there wasn't much in an English wood in the 16th century that you needed to be afraid of other than other human beings at that point. Um, but,
Mm,
it was still dark. It was still uh, a place of lawlessness.
mm,
Uh, and so I think it's almost like in Midsummer Night's Dream, it's a rite of passage for the young people, right? To survive this night in the forest. It's a rite of passage for the woods to come to Macbeth, and he's not going to survive that.
mm.
Uh, so it's almost even more than kind of a romantic like getaway. It's it's more of a testing ground,
Yes.
you know. And I can see how, that could really be exploited in Panto to bring a
Mm,
sense of both menace
mm,
and hedonism,
mm.
to a story. Uh, yeah,
So
awesome.
watch this space. I just
Oh,
yeah.
I can't wait to read that book. I
French that
I
chapter.
understand you got a lot going on. You're a busy fella, but I am definitely looking forward to that book.
Mm, me
So
too.
I know the feeling. I know the feeling.
And you've had some very
I have
exciting.
some exciting news. I do. I have a publisher for my silver book, and it's McFarland, and
Mm.
I could not be more pleased. They've been lovely to deal with, not the least of which they let me know when they received my proposal.
Oh wow.
I cannot tell you, listener, watcher, how rare that is for them just to send a nice little email saying, "We got it." Wonderful. Just wonderful. And so far my experience has been fantastic for a whole however many weeks. But I'm incredibly excited. And then, of course, the first thing that I realized after I'd sent the proposal and signed the contract was that I essentially have to start all over. This is um, you don't write a proposal the same way that you write a book. So even though I had written the first four chapters of this book, I'm essentially, starting from scratch, and it'll be a much better book because of it.
Mm,
I'm just thrilled beyond belief to be able to pursue this topic of the history of silver. It's fascinating and alarming. Uh, I'm obviously going to be learning a great deal and really happy to be having this project for the next year. And then, um, it opens up a lot of possibilities for me of where I want to go from this, what I want to write after this. But my question for you this time is that I saw a clip of Ian McKellen uh, doing a piece from Thomas More, which
mm,
he boldly claimed on national television that Shakespeare had written, which
mm,
because he's Ian McKellen, he can do that without any kind of
mm.
preamble, I guess. But it's not a play that's in the canon. So why was Ian McKellen able to say with so much confidence that Shakespeare had written part of Thomas More?
Well, it's interesting you say it's not in the canon. And our definition of the canon, are we just including plays in the first folio? Otherwise, I would say the canon of Shakespeare's works fluctuates
Hmm.
um, from time to time. And most scholars would agree that Shakespeare contributed to the Book of Sir Thomas More. And that's a play that survives in manuscript, and it's kept at the British Library. And we think there were 5 authors involved. So Anthony Mundy, Henry Shettle, Thomas Dekker, William Shakespeare, and Thomas Heywood. And to go back to what I was saying earlier about it being perfectly normal for playwrights of the period not to have a university education, that's 5 playwrights we believe are working for Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, on this play. And out of those 5 playwrights, only Thomas Heywood went to university, so far as we know. So he went to Cambridge. So it's a messy manuscript, right? This is a play dealing with topics such as immigration. It dramatizes the evil May Day riots of 1517, and it concerns a Catholic martyr during the reign of Queen Elizabeth's father. And the play is now generally dated around 1601, so during Elizabeth's reign. And it was the Book of Sir Thomas More that got me into authorship attribution studies.
Really?
It was a real threshold moment. I was doing an undergraduate module on bibliography, and we were looking at that play via an edition edited by John Jowett. And what John Jowett had done with his edition was try to replicate the manuscript, so you could see when one writer took over another. And there was something about that textual sleuthing, the different rhythms, the different voices, but also how each playwright was bringing something distinctive to the table in order to produce a play that was unique in the context of each dramatist's corpora, essentially. So you got Thomas Heywood adding a role for a clown. Thomas Heywood, prolific playwright, claimed to have a hand or at least a main finger in 220 plays. So a great dramatist to serve in a revising capacity. Thomas Dekker, he's very interested in urban city dwellers, and that's the kind of vibe he contributes to the play. And Shakespeare, great at writing speeches affirming civic authority. And that's what we see in The Stranger's Case. And it's undoubtedly Shakespeare, I think. There have been some doubts poured on that theory in recent years, but I think in terms of various analysis, it's been subjected to orthographical, paleographical. We think this is probably the only surviving example of Shakespeare's dramatic handwriting. That kind of analysis. It's got a high degree of community with other riot scenes that we see in plays like Henry VI Part 2 or Julius Caesar or Coriolanus, in terms of verbal parallels, in terms of shared phrases, as I was speaking about earlier, and just dramaturgically, I think that scene in particular is eminently Shakespearean, and he seems to have contributed speeches elsewhere in the play. But it's a very interesting play. It's quite chaotic. It's got an awful lot of roles. So Thomas More is an enormous part that I think even Richard Burbage might have struggled with. But it doesn't seem to have ever been performed. It doesn't seem to have escaped the hand of the censors. So the Master of the Revels, Edmund Tilney, you see him interjecting quite frequently in the manuscript, upon your own peril, delete this and so forth. But it's a very messy manuscript, but it offers fascinating insights into the fluidity of play scripts during the period, I think. And Ian McKellen, he's delivered that speech in many different contexts and always does a wonderful job. And I think it's a speech speaking about the stranger's case, Grantham removed, that reaches through the ages and shakes you violently by the shoulders. And Ian McKellen always does a wonderful job delivering it.
Well, yeah. He is
He's Ian McKellen.
he is Ian McKellen. Yeah. Uh, and it is an incredibly moving speech. And when I talk about the canon, I'm talking from a very layperson's point of view as myself in terms of, um, you know, what do we see in the great collected works of Shakespeare? Like,
Mm,
what is in those books? What is in the open source Shakespeare
mm,
website,
mm,
that is unquestionably attributed to Shakespeare?
mm.
And the there's other plays that I mean I have no doubt that that Shakespeare wrote for other plays, some of which I'm sure have sadly been lost.
Mm.
But there was definitely something Shakespearean about that speech, and it wasn't just
Yeah,
because Ian McKellen was delivering it. And it was
yeah,
it was profound and moving. And I mean,
yeah.
gosh, I would love to see perhaps a judiciously edited production
Yeah, me too.
of that.
Yeah.
That would be amazing because it's obviously very timely. Uh,
Mm. And it's a highly
unfortunately.
entertaining play. It's got a play within a play near the
Nice.
conclusion. Not by Shakespeare. We don't think. But yeah, I'd love to see it in performance. But yeah, that process of judicious editing would be quite lengthy, I think,
Hmm.
for a creative seeking to put the play on. But yeah, I hope that's certainly on my bucket list to see the play, not to edit it. My
Darn
bucket
it.
isn't quite big enough for that one. No, I'm not volunteering for
Yeah,
that.
it's a task. It's hard. It's hard editing plays, very difficult. So,
Mm,
and not fun either because you don't want to cut things,
yeah, yeah.
it's hard. As a
Mm,
director, I never wanted to cut anything, and that's that's
mm,
not always the way to go either. So,
no,
all
it's down to
righty.
the barbers with your beard, as
Yeah.
that might put it. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think we've reached, we have book recommendations.
No, we have not reached the end.
Oh,
There are
this
books
is a
to be
long
recommended.
episode. If you're still with us, watchers
You
and
say that
listeners,
every episode now. This is a long episode.
this is a long episode, but
We're
it's
having
an
a lot of
important one, I think. And
yes.
we do have some good recommendations. So how about you start with yours?
Yes, of course. So, on the topic of could Shakespeare have written Shakespeare, I would recommend Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, Evidence, Argument, Controversy. And that's a wonderful collection edited by Paul Edmondson and Stanley Wells. I'd also recommend James Shapiro's Contested Will, Who Wrote Shakespeare? And that's a fabulous historic account of various alternative theories. And there's a book that's coming out imminently, published by Manchester University Press, and it's Susan Amussen's What's in a Name? How Historians Know Shakespeare Was Shakespeare. So it's approaching the question very much from a historian's perspective, and I'm very excited to see that come out. And I wouldn't normally do this, but I think I would have to recommend my own book, Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers, because it does situate Shakespeare in that community of fellow playwrights, and it's a book that begins thinking about the education system and how a grammar school education would inform Shakespeare's career as an actor and as a playwright. So it's not a book that deals whatsoever, not in a single line, with the so-called authorship question, but it is a book very much about authorship and also about authorship attribution, which is a distinct field, by the way. Who wrote what? Who
Mhm.
influenced whom? So in this instance, yes, I think I would recommend my own
Oh,
book.
if you wouldn't have, I would have, because I found it very, very useful in my research for writing my own book about the influences behind Shakespeare's plays. I think when you first announced that it was about to be published, I think I said, "Oh, well, thank you for writing this book exactly when I needed it," because it definitely filled a gap in the literature that
Oh,
I couldn't find anything else that worked quite so well to help me navigate those questions in a way that then I felt able to put into my own book. And, obviously not to the detail that you did. And, I, even in my book, I tell people to read your book. So everybody go
oh,
read Darren's book. It's wonderful. And you'll get to learn a lot of exciting things about these playwrights, juicy details about their lives. Uh, it's a good read. It's a good read. I really enjoyed it. And I'm also going to recommend William Shakespeare's Small Latine and Less Greek by
yeah.
Thomas Whitfield Baldwin. And this was
Very
written in 1890. And he goes to tremendous effort to describe the kind of education that was being offered to people of Shakespeare's class at Shakespeare's time. And,
mm,
the foundational text. If you really want to get
mm.
into the nitty gritty of what education was like, then that's the text to use.
Oh, it's
Um,
indispensable, Baldwin. Yeah,
mhm.
that's a tremendous study.
Tiffany Stern's Rehearsal from Shakespeare to Sheridan, uh, also foundational text for understanding the way that plays were produced and rehearsed, and really helped me understand why Shakespeare was uniquely placed to write the books that he did. The Elizabethan World Picture by E.M. Tilliard, I could just recommend for every episode because he does a wonderful job of explaining just kind of the whole zeitgeist of what people were thinking at the time, what their preconceived notions were. Uh, um, Lena Cohen Orlin's The Private Life of William Shakespeare is one of the best biographies currently out, and she's very careful not to overstep. For the most part, I would say she gets a little enthusiastic and carried away about the idea that Shakespeare was an apprentice to a butcher and that he married Anne to get away from it. Plausible? Yes. I don't know that we can say it with the certainty that she feels that she can, but I encourage you, reader, to read it and decide for yourself. She provides a lot of wonderful historical context uh, for all of Shakespeare's life, as much as we know. And let's see, I'm going to recommend one more, maybe two more. One is The Shakespearean Playing Companies by Andrew Gurr, that gives
Oh,
a lot of context again about the way plays were produced and the way the community behaved as a whole. Really fascinating stuff. Uh, and I think that was one of the books that talked about fame and how it operated differently in that time. And finally, last but not least, is Caroline Francis's William Shakespeare, Shakespeare's Imagery and What It Tells Us uh, by Martino Fine Books. And this is kind of a more poetic, um, uh, well, the imagery is right there in the name, but basically she goes through and she finds every time that Shakespeare talks about sailing or dogs or making gloves and makes a really interesting case for we can see what Shakespeare definitely knew about by the way he talked about these particular subjects. We can't say what he didn't know about, but he clearly knew something about the nautical arts, let's say. He clearly knew something about making gloves. He knew something about bear baiting. We can say with a fair degree of certainty that he had seen a bear baiting at some point. Nothing controversial about that, but
Mm.
she builds some interesting arguments, and I will stop there.
That was a fabulous list, and yeah, the Tiffany Stern book is
Hmm.
a particular favorite of mine there, and yes, the T.W. Baldwin and the Andrew Gurr. I mean, they're just magisterial studies, so
They are.
really fantastic. Yes, yes, I love your book
Oh, thank
recommendations.
you.
Well,
Yeah,
we
and what book? 2027, my book comes out. So if you're seeing this in 2027, if not, then you have to wait. And
or pre-order.
not yet, not even yet. We can't even do that
Oh,
yet. So,
okay. Well, watch this space, future viewers and
all right.
listeners. Thanks and ever thanks to those of you watching and listening to Shakespeare and Friends. Until the next time, it's a warm farewell from Rachel and me.
Bye bye.